Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. China lashed out on Wednesday at renewed threats from the White House on trade, warning that it was ready to fight back if Washington was looking for a trade war days ahead of a planned visit by U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. In an unexpected change in tone, the United States said on Tuesday that it had still held the threat of imposing tariffs on $50 billion of imports from China unless it addressed the issue of theft of American intellectual property. Its tougher stance comes as President Donald Trump prepares for a June 12th summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, whose key diplomatic backer is China, and as Washington steps up efforts to counter what it sees as Beijing's efforts to limit freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. The trade escalation came after the two sides had agreed during talks in Washington this month to find steps to narrow China's $375 billion trade surplus. Ross is expected to try to get China to agree to firm numbers to buy more U.S. goods during a June 2nd to 4th visit to the Chinese capital. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze if the US-China trade war is back on. Joining me on the program today are Pramit Pal Chowdhury, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, Sheelkant Sharma, former diplomat, Zorawar Daulat Singh, fellow Centre for Policy Research, and S.K. Sarkar, managing committee member, ASSOCHAM. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you. First, let's try and put into perspective and find out if the US-China trade war is back on.
From the newspapers, it seems to be very much on. Because just last week, when the Chinese were in Washington, there was this whole idea about the ZTE being left off the hook, and there was some kind of a deal. But suddenly, for the last 2 days, there's this thing going very hot. And what surprises is the language coming from Beijing. Beijing has been a little more sedate in its responses. But now, suddenly they've unleashed Global Times, and, the kind of vituperation which is coming up from China shows their anger. It may have to do with not only trade, but also things like,
South China Sea.
South China Sea, and they've been thrown out of that, Pacific Rim exercise for which they were part of it. But so there's a major exercise which is happening. It's really huge in every sense. But China is out of it. It used to be part of it. And this was something which started in '71. So maybe on geopolitics, it might be a kind of a knock at China. And this was done when Wang Yi was in Washington. At that time, the Americans announced that, well, this is off for you. The South China Sea also, now the defense secretary is saying that we will have a steady drumbeat and all that stuff. So they are trying to tell China that you cannot really keep the 9-dash line and keep South China Sea to yourself. Though about that, I do not know where matters rest, because analysts are now saying, some of them are very pessimistic. They say South China Sea is gone. The Chinese have already occupied it in a way that none of them would like to really. It's the go game where they seem to have got an upper hand now.
Right.
So it's not. I would say trade war is there, but you could also say that the US suddenly is now revealing a number of cards.
Right.
So the Chinese are somewhat flabbergasted that they were so far thinking that that US is one track, but now suddenly you have 4 or 5 things which are on the things.
Indeed. Zorawar, what has changed really from Washington to this week?
Yeah. So you have to look at this as part of a constant bargaining process that the Trump administration has been attempting for the last year. The first round of talks we saw between the US and China didn't lead to much a few weeks ago. So, and I think there's an impression within the United States that they believe that the Chinese perceive that they can't take it all the way in a trade war, which is perhaps some of it is true. That can the Trump administration bear the costs of a full-on economic confrontation, even though China is more dependent on the United States and vice versa in trade terms? The rationale for that is that the political cycle that Trump faces for the short-term pain simply does not prevail, while the Chinese can perhaps bear a more short-term sort of pain. So that's one facet of what's happening. I also see a little bit of incoherence in the way the United States is approaching this, because they would like to reduce the trade deficit with the Chinese. That's of course the number one political goal. It's a big ticket item. You show your domestic constituency that you can bring jobs, or certainly at least reduce that.
But that has been happening in the US.
What has?
You know, the economy, as far as the United States is concerned, it seems to be picking up, and he seems to be addressing those problems at home.
Yeah. What the second part, I think what the United States is also sort of straddling with is, should they go after just tactical trade gains, or should they go after the much more larger strategic question of slowing down the technology transfers that are happening with the Chinese? So I think that tension is creating a contradiction within the United States on what to pursue first. Now, the Chinese response is that if you want to reduce a trade deficit, why don't you increase your high technology exports to the Chinese? But that undermines the second goal.
Right.
So part of this process is, the second contradiction I'm seeing in all this is this crescendo or escalation in the economic front is happening at a time when you are tacitly coordinating with the Chinese on the Korean question. So how does it interplay with that? So you're seeing a whole lot of facets play out, and I think the Trump administration, as my interpretation is that they are trying to put up a credible posture before the next round of talks, and I think Wilbur Ross is going to be leading the delegation. They're going to be there. So, and they're hoping that they get something out of this. I don't expect a big deal to come out of it, but certainly they will come back with something, and then they can sort of showcase a little bit of domestic success.
Let me bring in SK Sarkar now into the picture. You know, SK Sarkar, why is Washington, trying to escalate trade tensions with Beijing at this point in time?
Well, let us try and understand with Trump. See, Trump is a negotiator. He was a businessman, and today he's trying to negotiate. And in fact, there are the 6 words that he uses are issue threats, strike deal, declare victory. So that is the policy which Trump has been following all through. And today, what is happening on that 50 billion, on which USA has announced that they will be putting in extra tariffs, is nothing but a kind of a threat, which is just for negotiation purposes. He's trying to bargain. But I would say that let's look at our own country. I think we are pretty affected by what is happening on this trade war aspect. The first thing is that Trump said that this is on the basis of national security when he started on steel and aluminium. But if you look at Article 21 of GATS, which is a General Agreement on Trade and Services, obviously that talks about ammunition and arms and ammunition and fissionable material. So it's not really in that category at all. Importantly, what US says about India, and which is I think very important, is that when you presented the budget, you upped the import tariffs on 46 items, many of which are coming from USA. And even a few days back, on 5 items like wheat, then we had unshelled almonds, then we had protein concentrates, walnuts, etc. The duties have been increased. These are going to affect India's trade with China, with America, and America and then we have our Commerce Minister, Mr. Suresh Prabhu, going to US to negotiate GSP, which is the Generalized Preference System of Preferences. Now, which expired in December 2017. Now, if you go to negotiate and all this, and here you on zero tariffs, we've been exporting something like, on an annual basis, we've been exporting about 5,600 crores US dollars of items. Now, if you're going to negotiate all these items, so obviously you'll have to listen to them also as to where you stand. And then you have the export promotion schemes also, which are a little wavering right now, because the US has taken you to the dispute settlement body of WTO, and it is very likely from whatever message is coming through that WTO is likely to accept US's plea.
Right.
So these
Points
are
taken.
factors which are playing, and not to miss out on the
Points
S-400
taken,
missiles,
Mr.
which
Sarkar,
we
as
are
to
importing
how it's
from
going to
Russia.
impact India and what
So
the
if
India
you- if
impact
you,
really is going to be. Let me bring in the other panelists as well on this. But before I get into how it's going to impact India, really, let's talk about the talks itself. The talks between US and China slated to take place later this week. Do you believe that all this is being done by the Trump administration as a pressure tactics to leverage the talks itself, Pramit?
Well, the talks are going to be attempting to resolve this fundamental issue about how do you, I mean, what is America trying to do? Trump was elected on a very clear argument that China, and he's not completely incorrect there, that China plays the international trading system through its manipulation of currencies and so on, subsidy structures. And therefore, it's the trade. But he's a mercantilist in his economic thinking, so he's focused almost solely on the issue of the trade surplus that China has. And he's basically telling China, you've got to reduce this, because politically, that's what I'm going to be selling when I go into my elections, midterm elections in November, and potentially for re-election later, 3 years down the line. So when the initial the initial clash of tariffs, where both sides kept imposing tariffs, now the Chinese became nervous because at one point they had reached the level where they really had nothing more to impose tariffs on, because they're the ones who have an enormous surplus. They was actually running out of objects to impose on. But they very sensibly used the crackdown on farming imports from soybean and corn from America, because that hurt the conservative farming states, which are big Trump supporters. A lot of them, you saw, a lot of the senators in Nebraska and Kansas came out against Trump and said this is a silly policy. And you saw Trump therefore halt at this point. And the Chinese seem to have assumed, given that America then sent a team, that now you were just going to sit down and talk. And you were going to figure out ways to reduce the number of that trade surplus by we can import. Well, basically the Chinese made a number of offers. We can import more coal, oil from America, more soybean, whatever, and so stuff like that. But there are fundamental issues, and then Trump got under attack from corporate America and from his own Republican Party in the Washington establishment, because he made a concession on ZTE, which was a Chinese telephone company that had been sanctioned by the United States because of its breaking of sanctions against Iran. And so on, and other issues. And when he then said, okay, I'll roll back the ZTE game, you saw an enormous anger in Washington on this point. And so you saw then Trump go back to the tariff battle. And the Chinese are actually surprised, because they said, we thought we had an understanding that the tariff game was over and we were now in a negotiating process. Trump has gone back. So the problem with the Trump administration, and the Chinese, when you talk to them, say, they're confident that they are in a position to eventually win this struggle, because they see complete incoherence on the Washington part. But the unpredictability of Trump also worries them, because they're not clear he understands how trade negotiations actually go through.
Sure.
And the final concern that they have, which is that if this starts to spin out of control, because right now, remember, none of these tariffs have actually been imposed.
Right.
These start from the beginning, they're all threats. But the first lot of them will come into play in a few days' time. Their concern is that if the tariffs actually begin to be applied and both sides begin retaliation, that it'll poison the atmosphere to the point that negotiations will no longer be possible.
Indeed.
And second, it then spills into the military domain.
Sure. Ambassador, as far as the US is concerned, what is it that it wants from China?
I think what Pramit has said is what they want. Basically, they want China to reduce the trade deficit, and so they are looking at every which way they can press China for it. Chinese initially thought that they could get away with some deal making, but that doesn't seem to work.
So the trade deficit is the crux of the problem then, as far as the US is concerned.
No, but then, as I said earlier, that now many more balls are in the air. See,
yes.
Like the technology export, it is a major point, and this ZTE, the problem is still persisting because of technology export. You see, what had happened in the 90s, also the Americans were insisting on intellectual property rights. At that time, China was still coming up, so they were willing to concede. But after they joined WTO in the beginning of this century, and the way they have been manipulating the whole system, they feel they are on a stronger position. Trump, for the first time, is coming out with a seesawing, suddenly he comes and says things. So a shock treatment, as one of the experts has said, it helps at times. Some of these Americans themselves have said this helps. So trade talks are, and then if you see the delegation, there are 50-member delegation which is already going to be there, and some of the officials are already present in China. So apparently this meeting which Wilbur Ross is going to hold in China is an important meeting.
Right.
And again, like Trump not looking for failures, I think this delegation also would like to come back with some success. So the point is to see what can the Chinese do, or what can the Chinese give at this juncture.
In fact, that was going to be my next question, really. What are China's options? What is China's strategy going to be, Zorawar?
So the number one leverage that they have is they may have an asymmetry on the trading side, where they're vulnerable, assuming the political cycle can be sustained, is on the investment side and market access. If you look at, these are slightly dated numbers that I have, but until very recently, maybe a few years ago, a lot of the exports that were generated within China, going back to the United States, were US corporations operating in China either independently or in concert with other Chinese enterprises. So that itself tells you that they have enormous amount of leverage based on US corporate actors who are going to lobby on their behalf to secure their own interests. In terms of going forward, the big ticket that they hold is increasing market access to a whole set of new sectors coming up, both in terms of consumer electronics, financial services, a whole sort of services sector where the United States has been wanting greater access. So that part will give them bargaining leverage to restrain the US hand, which is more short-term benefits that they would like on the trading front. So that's certainly, in terms of an investment bilateral treaty, that's something which the United States possibly could work at. So I would look at this not as a big bang event, the second round that we're going to see. This is going to be a continuous process that's going to play out. But if you look at if you just step back and see the timelines, Xi Jinping now in power for fairly long time to come, Trump going into a midterm election cycle, national elections, who has the stomach to play that escalation game? I don't think the United States has that, and there's no way to change that perception, because these are timelines that are going to be playing out.
Right,
so
right.
I would say the deep interdependence that the United States and China do have restrain both sides from letting this into an open economic confrontation. Within this constraint, there will be bargaining, sort of shadow boxing, which will play out. And I would suspect that they will get a little bit, both sides will be able to pull a little bit more. But for the sake of the global economy, what we would like to see in terms of some sort of stabilization is for the United States generally to become less of a great importing nation.
Sure. That was what I was going to come to. As far as the world is concerned, as far as globalization is concerned, SK Sarkar, what does it really mean, the trade war between the US and China?
Yeah, but let me just complete what the other panelists been saying. You see, it's $375 billion is definitely a bother. But I think what is at the back of Trump's mind is the intellectual property rights, which he thinks are being misused by the Chinese, and that is a factor. And as far as the globalization factor is concerned, then obviously there was a reference to ZTE Corporation. Now but Trump has a sanction of 1.3 billion on them, and it has and if ZTE does not produce anymore, the effect will be on India also, because our 4G telecom services get affected greatly if they do not operate. And other things like of course, as you mentioned also, US is trying to bring down its trade deficit to the extent possible. And as I was talking about the missiles also, Russia is going to import 39,000 crores of missiles, S-400. And if you look at the breakup of the imports of military equipment, Russia imports about 62% into India, whereas US imports about 32%. They want that to go up. As I said in the beginning also, Trump is a businessman who is negotiating. This is a hard bargain he's trying to strike. And importantly, what we must also understand that China on US import cars has actually brought down their tariffs from 25% to 15%. So it is not that China is not listening to Trump, but of course there'll be, as was mentioned, there'll be some shadow boxing always going on. But we will reach a situation in which certain things would balance out. And as far as the globalization is concerned, I think Trump has a point when he says that if I give you defense, if I give you protection, you're not monetizing that. You are only looking at the goods and services, exports and imports. So those factors will also have to be taken into consideration.
Right.
These are part of globalization process. Maybe we have a new rule coming up. Multilateralism, unfortunately, today is on the back seat, and we have to have negotiations on a bilateral basis.
Okay.
And obviously, whatever is happening on the globe, whatever is happening between two nations, will have an effect globally, because we are part of the globalization. We can't escape that.
Okay, points taken. Multilateralism is on the back foot. It's the time for bilaterals at the moment, is what SK Sarkar is suggesting. You know, talking about bilaterals, the big one coming up on June 12th. Pramit, you know, on today of tomorrow, there's been a lot of speculation on whether that will actually happen or not. The trade war or everything that's been happening between US and China, is that going to have any bearing on the Kim-Trump summit?
Actually, I don't think so. Initially, I used to think that, yes, it was one of the reasons why America was backing down on a few issues was because of North Korea. But I would argue right now, and everything I'm hearing, is that Kim is the real player in most of this. He has taken most of the initiative, and both with the Chinese and the Americans and Russia and South Korea and Japan, he's been the one who's actually been bringing a lot of this together. What we're seeing, and we can only speculate because we don't actually know what's happening in Kim's mind, he seems to having succeeded in getting South Korea to help them broker an understanding with the summit with the United States with Trump. We saw that in the breakdown on the issue of denuclearization. But it seems at that point, then we saw him say he's now sent his own envoy to Washington. And in the same way that Trump had sent Pompeo to Pyongyang. Now, what was interesting, I think we're now seeing, is that both Kim and Trump are desperate to have this summit for whatever reason. They see this as being Kim, I can understand. Trump, I think, just sees this as a means to. Trump has a great belief, and I think Mr. Sarkar correctly, in a belief as a real estate magnate that he has great persuasive powers. And this is a man who sells buildings and apartments. He's used to dealing with difficult people on the other side of the table. And he has a great belief that he can play this game very well. A lot of professional diplomats, of course, have different views on this, and they've come out publicly on this. But so he desperately wants the summit. So does Kim. And so my guess is right now they're agreeing that we won't have an agenda. The original denuclearization talk, all of that stuff, the preconditions will effectively be wiped out, and we'll meet and then see what happens. So I would say that if I were to, I would give odds that it was likely now to happen, now that having had the first round of disagreements and Trump canceling, Kim recognizing that he needed to, that at least with Trump you need to watch what you're saying. And that there are a large number of groups in Washington who would like the summit not to happen. That's gone through.
Right, sure. Okay, quick closing comments now from all my guests, starting with you, Ambassador. What does it mean for India?
For India, this US-China fracas is not good. Because the way they've been cooperating and the size of their economies are now, at a very different universe. Our economies are not in that level. So if there is turbulence in the economies of that size, its effect will be all over. So I think some kind of a modus vivendi, if it emerges out of them, it should be good. However, the point is that we are better off with a multilateral rule-based system. And the Chinese are also saying that the rule-based system is good. Somehow or the other, they are sweeping everything on Trump's door, saying that he's the one who's actually not following the rules.
Yeah, and he's being protectionist is what everyone has been saying. Yeah.
So now this is where the uncertainty lies. And we have to see how this uncertainty gap is closed.
Sure. Zohar, do we need to watch out for what's happening between US and China? Do we need to be wary?
I think so. I think what we're seeing is the posture that's being brought about, particularly by the United States, is not China-centric alone. We're seeing a phenomenon in US foreign policy where they're trying to transition to a new foreign policy. And that is creating a serious amount of destabilization on the economy, on politics, geopolitics. So unfortunately, we are in a position where, as another rising power in Asia, you've got to step in situations to tilt that balance on particular issues. So we might find situations where you find common ground with the Chinese on a whole range of economic issues, or even on the Korean Peninsula, you want stability there. But on other matters like the broader Asian balance of power, you might find common ground with the United States that let there be a broad-based multipolar system. So you're going to have to straddle both these two major powers. How you do that is, of course, going to be a function of strategic skill, leadership, and your institutions that you have at home.
Sure. SK Sarkar, wait and watch approach, is that what we need to use?
I think so, because this is a process which will go on for some time. And as I said, I keep repeating also that Trump is a businessman. He's trying to strike a hard bargain. He doesn't like the fact that America imports so much. He only wants that import to go down, and that's the message he wants to send out to the world. If he's taken on China, it is because China is the big boy. He's actually giving a message to everybody that you need to also consume my products, and let's all be part of the global process. I think he's right in that respect. What I don't agree with him is his manner, his attitude, the way he's giving out the message. So we have to keep our fingers crossed. But I think Trump is only trying to say, and this is his ultimate message, that please decrease the imports into US.
All right, talking about messages, there have been a couple of messages sent India's way as well from the United States. We've seen the newspapers, carry all those messages whole of yesterday and today as well. Pramit-Pal Chaudhary, is there a line that we need to draw as far as the US is concerned?
Well, on the trade front, I think Mr. Sarkar has correctly pointed out, we are also a country that has a trade surplus with the United States, and Trump has made it clear he wants that reduced. He also has IPR issues with us. The Harley-Davidson and the stents are the two biggest, stent price controls are the two biggest issues he has personally raised with Modi himself. And so the game now will be not so much as, this is not unusual, we've had previous trade battles with the United States on these issues. But for us, of course, we have a strategic relationship that we also want to maintain, and so do the Americans. So the game has always been, how do you manage the trade side? What concessions do you have to make? What concessions will the Americans make on the trade side? But keeping a strategic relationship on trade. The bigger issue will be the question of the sanctions regarding Iran and Russia. I'm not overly concerned about Iran. There's nothing particularly spectacular about our trade relationship with Iran. But the issue of Russian defense equipment continues to be very important.
Especially.
Well, just anything, because even our entire Air Force is still very dependent, is Russian. So it needs Russian spare parts. And even those will be sanctioned, given that there's a $15 million limit, which will trigger the sanctions. More than the S-400 is the fact that almost still a large chunk of our Air Force cannot fly without Russian parts.
Sure.
So that is going to be a bigger issue, in my view, and much more difficult, because it is not Trump who's driving that. It is the US Congress.
Right. All right. Yes, Ambassador.
Our dependence on Russian exports is on the offensive side of our military capability.
Right.
Whatever we are getting from the US is on the defensive side.
So that's something that we need to keep in mind. All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.